It's the night of June 5th, 1944. The most consequential military operation in human history is hours away from beginning. 156,000 soldiers are about to risk their lives storming the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. Everything, the future of Europe, the fate of millions, depends on whether Adolf Hitler keeps his most powerful army in the wrong place. And the man responsible for making sure that happens? He's not a soldier. He's not a general. He has no military training whatsoever. He's a former chicken farmer from Catalonia who taught himself to be a spy using tourist guidebooks, outdated newspapers, and his own extraordinary imagination. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, and on that night, sitting alone at a radio transmitter somewhere in England, he was about to pull off the greatest lie in the history of warfare. This is his story. To understand how Juan Pujol Garcia became the man who fooled Hitler, you have to understand where he came from, because his entire childhood was essentially a training ground for deception, though not by design. He was born in Barcelona in 1912, and from his very earliest years, he existed between two worlds that despised each other. His father was a liberal, a secularist, a man who believed in science and workers' rights. His mother was a devout Catholic who valued obedience, tradition, and the authority of the church. Every single dinner in that household was a negotiation between two incompatible worldviews. Most children in that situation would just pick a side. Juan did something different. He learned how to be whatever the room needed him to be. He learned how to listen, how to read people, and how to mirror back exactly what they wanted to hear. He didn't think of it as lying. He thought of it as surviving. When he was sent to a strict Catholic boarding school run by monks, that instinct was tested almost immediately. He clashed with the rigid structure, fought with teachers, and eventually walked out after a particularly humiliating confrontation with one of the brothers. By 13, he was working in a hardware shop with no diploma, no connections, and no clear future. But he had something rarer than any of that. He was a natural linguist. Catalan, Spanish, French. He picked them up the way other people pick up accents, almost unconsciously. And more importantly, he was an obsessive people reader. He could walk into a room and within minutes understand what each person feared, wanted, and believed. That's not a skill you can teach. That's something you're either born with or you aren't. Then came the Spanish Civil War, and it nearly killed him. In 1936, Spain tore itself apart along ideological lines. Republicans on one side, Franco's nationalists on the other. Juan got caught in the middle, literally. He was conscripted by the Republicans, who promptly jailed him because his father had owned a factory, which made him, in their eyes, a class enemy. When he eventually ended up in the Nationalist Army, they'd beat him for showing Republican sympathies. Both sides suspected him. Both sides were right to, and completely wrong. He didn't belong to either. He belonged to himself. By the time the Civil War ended in 1939, Juan had absorbed a lesson that would define the rest of his life. Ideology is a cage, and the man who wears no ideological label can walk through any door. He had no love for fascism, no love for communism. What he had was a deep, almost philosophical contempt for systems that demanded loyalty at the cost of independent thought. And then the Second World War began, and Juan decided to do something about it. He walked into the German embassy in Madrid, introduced himself as a Spanish nationalist who despised Britain, and claimed he had business connections in England that would allow him to travel there frequently and collect intelligence. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was skeptical but intrigued. They gave him a basic kit: invisible ink, a simple code book, instructions on how to pass information through dead drop locations, and they told him, "Prove yourself. Send us reports." What they did not know was that Juan had absolutely no intention of going to England. Instead, he went to the Lisbon Public Library. For months, Juan Pujol Garcia built an entire fictional existence in Britain using tourist guidebooks, old railway timetables, British newspapers that were a few days out of date, propaganda newsreels from cinemas, and maps. He had never set foot in England. He studied it the way an actor studies a role, obsessively, from the outside, trying to absorb every detail until he could fake being there. And then he started writing intelligence reports that dripped with the texture of authenticity. His first dispatch described the docks at Liverpool. He used real ship names he'd found in newspapers, invented dull observations about dock workers and weather, and wrote everything in the flat, bureaucratic language of someone filing routine paperwork. That was his first great insight. Real intelligence doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds like someone filling out a form. Spy thrillers have it completely backwards. The Germans read his report and loved it precisely because it wasn't exciting. His second report introduced a fictional sub-agent, a Portuguese sailor named Jose, who worked on British merchant vessels. Why was Jose helping the Nazis? Money. Simple, boring, human, the kind of reason real people betray secrets. The Germans believed it immediately. And so Juan kept going. He invented more agents, each with a fully realized backstory: a Swiss businessman in London, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow. Venezuelan specifically because Juan could fake a Latin American accent if he ever needed to perform it, a disgruntled former soldier in Wales with gambling debts. Every fictional person had a reason to be there, a reason to be helping, and a reason their information might occasionally be incomplete or delayed. He was writing a novel. A very, very dangerous novel. Here's where things got strange and brilliant. At some point in 1942, American intelligence intercepted one of the messages Juan had been sending to Germany. They flagged it immediately. There was a highly active German spy ring operating out of Britain, apparently generating significant volumes of intelligence. Code name for the lead agent? Arabelle. Britain needed to find this person fast. British counterintelligence launched an investigation. They checked every suspected German agent in the country. They found nothing because Arabelle wasn't in Britain. He'd never been there. Then someone at MI5 had a thought. What about that persistent Spanish man who kept turning up at the embassy in Lisbon? They tracked Juan down, and this time they listened. When they realized what he had already accomplished entirely on his own, running a fictional spy network that had successfully fooled the Abwehr for over a year, they didn't just recruit him, they were astonished. Juan arrived in England in April 1942 and was assigned a handler named Thomas Harris, a wealthy art dealer who spoke fluent Spanish and had the kind of sophisticated, lateral mind needed to work with someone like Juan. Together, they didn't just maintain the fictional network, they expanded it dramatically. By 1944, Juan's imaginary spy ring had grown to 27 people, 27 completely invented human beings, each with a biography, a personality, a set of complaints, a financial situation, and a reason for their loyalties. When one of the fictional agent's wives got sick, Juan filed expense reports for her doctor visits and asked Germany for an advance on salary to cover the medical bills. Germany sent the money without question. When another agent was killed in a fictional bombing raid, Juan wrote a genuinely moving letter of condolence to the Germans and requested pension payments for the man's widow and children. Germany approved it. He was essentially running a soap opera, and the Germans were paying the production costs. But here's where the mechanism that made the whole thing work, and it's genuinely subtle. Almost everything Juan reported was true. MI5 would feed him accurate information, real convoy departures, real troop movements, real equipment transfers. Juan would verify the details, write immaculate reports, and then simply wait. He'd send the report 12 to 36 hours after the event described had already occurred. By the time German Naval Command could scramble submarines or dispatch reconnaissance, the convoy was already at its destination. The intelligence was perfectly accurate. It was also perfectly useless. And crucially, the Germans didn't blame Juan for the delays. They blamed the slow communication channels. They actually gave him a salary increase and told him to build out his network so they could get faster coverage. He had turned chronic lateness into a feature of the system. Month after month, year after year, the Abwehr read Arabelle's reports and concluded they had the most reliable agent in Britain, a man whose information was always solid, always verifiable, always just frustratingly delayed. They trusted him absolutely. Juan was building something. He was building credit. And he was saving it for one specific moment. By the spring of 1944, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, was in its final planning stages. The Normandy landing was set for early June. The challenge wasn't just getting soldiers onto the beaches. It was keeping Hitler's best forces away long enough for the invasion to succeed. The Germans had a massive, heavily armed army, the 15th Army, positioned along the French coast near Calais, about 150 miles northeast of Normandy. If those forces were sent to reinforce Normandy during the critical first hours of the invasion, they could potentially drive the Allies back into the sea. Everything depended on Hitler believing that Normandy was a feint and that the real blow was coming somewhere else. Operation Fortitude was the Allied deception plan designed to create exactly that belief, and Juan Pujol Garcia was its central weapon. For weeks before D-Day, Juan had been feeding Germany a stream of reports hinting at a massive Allied buildup in southeastern England. Fictitious divisions assembling near Dover, fabricated rail traffic increases, invented preparations consistent with an attack aimed at Calais. All of it layered carefully into his otherwise accurate reporting, so the lies were inseparable from the truth. Then came the night itself, June 5th, 1944. Hours before the invasion began, Juan sat at his transmitter to send what would become the most consequential message of the war. He needed to contact his German handlers immediately to warn them, falsely, that the Normandy operation was a diversion and that the real strike force was still waiting in England, aimed at Calais. The problem was, nobody answered. The German radio operator assigned to monitor Arabelle's transmissions had gone home early. For hours, Juan sent signals into silence. This was a catastrophe. If he couldn't reach them in time, his warning would arrive too late to be believed. So he made a decision. When the German operator finally came back online in the early hours of June 6th, with Allied soldiers already hitting the beaches, Juan didn't send a calm, measured report. He sent fury. His message crackled with genuine outrage. "Where have you been? I have been trying to reach you for hours. I have critical intelligence, and you weren't there to receive it." It was a performance, but it was a perfect one, because a real spy in that situation would be furious. The anger made everything that followed more believable. And then he delivered the lie. His agents, he reported, had confirmed that Normandy was a diversion. The main invasion force, he claimed 50 full divisions, over 750,000 soldiers, was still staged in England, awaiting the order to strike at Calais. The message climbed the chain of command rapidly. By mid-morning, it was on the desk of Hitler's chief of operations. By the time Hitler himself read it, Allied forces were already establishing footholds on 5 Normandy beaches, and German commanders on the ground were screaming for the panzer divisions at Calais to be released. Hitler held them back. He trusted Arabelle more than he trusted his own generals. The 15th Army, 150,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, the best equipped German force in France, sat at Calais and waited for an invasion that existed only in Juan Pujol Garcia's imagination. They waited for days, then weeks. Even as the Allied foothold in Normandy grew unbreakable, even as the liberation of France began to unfold, the Germans kept significant forces in the wrong place because Arabelle kept insisting the real blow was still coming. It never came. Historians who have studied the campaign estimate that Juan's deception saved somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Allied lives on D-Day alone, with the total figure potentially much higher across the weeks that followed. In July 1944, Adolf Hitler personally approved the award of the Iron Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors, to Agent Arabelle. The citation praised his courage, dedication, and invaluable service to the Reich. The man receiving that honor was simultaneously being prepared for a decoration from King George VI. In November 1944, Juan Pujol Garcia stood in Buckingham Palace and was awarded the Member of the Order of the British Empire. The citation, which was classified, said only that it was for services to the nation. The king had no idea he was shaking hands with someone who had also received a medal from Hitler. He became one of the only individuals in history to receive military honors from both sides of the same war for the same work, interpreted in completely opposite ways. Germany gave him a medal for loyalty. Britain gave him a medal for betrayal. He was the same man doing the same thing, seen through completely different lenses. He kept both medals. He rarely looked at them. After the war, Juan Pujol Garcia's life took a sharp turn into silence. His marriage to a woman who had helped him in the early days, who had typed coded messages and maintained cover stories and risked her own safety, didn't survive the aftermath. Imagine being married to someone who had spent years professionally inhabiting multiple false identities every single day. The war ended, but the habits didn't just disappear. In 1949, Juan staged his own death. He faked an illness, traveled to Angola, and then died, at least on paper. Fake certificate, fake announcement, and then silence. He moved to Venezuela, took a new name, and opened a small bookshop in Caracas. For decades, the world believed Juan Pujol Garcia was dead. He sold books, lived quietly, and told no one who he really was or what he had done. It wasn't until the 1980s when a historian tracking down D-Day veterans discovered he was still alive and still sharp that his story finally became public. He gave interviews, wrote a memoir, and allowed the world to finally place his name alongside the event it had shaped. He died in 1988. At 76 years old in Venezuela, far from Normandy, far from Berlin, far from the war he had helped to end without ever once firing a weapon. Juan Pujol Garcia, chicken farmer, bookshop owner, the greatest double agent in history, remains the only man to have outsmarted the entire Nazi intelligence apparatus using nothing more than a library card and an extraordinary understanding of how people believe what they want to believe. If you found this story as compelling as I did, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this coming. And drop a comment below. What part of Juan's operation do you think was the most brilliant? I'd love to know what stood out to you.